This is Research Like a Pro, episode 199, Identifying John Wilson, Part 2, Documentary Evidence. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Welcome everyone to Research Like a Pro. We're glad to be here together with Rick again to talk about the Wilson Research Project. Hi, Rick.
Hi, Nicole and Diana.
Hi, so glad to have you back.
So how have you been doing? What are you working on?
I have been working on our DNA study group project, and I'm doing the leads method on the DNA test takers results that I'm using, and I've never done that before. She's my second cousin, and so I decided I need to get more familiar with her matches, and it's very interesting because the leads methods show that most of her top matches are on our line. She has very few, which is her maternal line. She has very few paternal matches. So the people on her father's side just did not test, or there were not many descendants. But as you know, on the maternal side, there were 10 children. And so just tons more matches. Anyway, It's been very illuminating because I didn't know much about her actual DNA matches.
Yeah, the same thing that I found with your results. I was doing leads method on your 23andMe matches, and there just aren't very many matches on your side from England, the Kelsey Beddoes line. We have a lot on your paternal side because they're all from the colonial US, and there's a lot of descendants in America who've tested their DNA with 23andMe, but not as many from England. It's interesting to see how those trends and family sizes influence the number of matches.
And cultural prohibitions against testing. A lot of people just don't test in Europe or England or Germany.
Yeah, which is why I really like Living DNA, because I feel like, they are a British company and their focus on British ancestry. I think that brings in more test takers over there.
And more people that actually have that more recent ancestry in England like we do. And it's been fun using my mom's DNA at Living DNA because she's got 3 of her lines directly from England, and they are grandparent lines. I mean, they're close lines. And so we get really specific regions that she is from. So fun to look at it.
Well, let's jump into talking about the Wilsons. So, Rick, can you give us a recap of our last episode with you last week about identifying John Wilson's origins?
Yes, so we were talking about my ancestor, John Wilson, who was born about 1716 and died in 1799 in Franconia Township, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And what we last talked about was using Y-DNA and autosomal DNA to kind of help point me in the direction of, where in Europe John Wilson's ancestors likely came from. Y-DNA really pointed me towards County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland, and autosomal DNA identified several clusters of DNA matches that had that appeared to be tied to my Wilson line, and also had County Fermanagh origins. And so, using that is where I'm going to be taking the research into the documentary space.
So whenever you say Irish research, anyone who's ever worked in that area just kind of groans because it is not easy. So just tell us some of the challenges that you face, because we're talking Irish research in the 1700s, which is even more difficult.
Yes, it was very daunting, and to be honest, for many years I put off doing some of this research just because I felt, overwhelmed by it and lack of familiarity. But what I started to do was really what is step 3 of the Research Like a Pro process, which is locality research. And I really dug in my heels and started looking at what records exist. And for me, because I was dealing with Northern Ireland, there is an Ulster historical foundation that really provided a great foundation for the different types of records that are available there. And you're right, Diana, the 1700s, it's sparse to begin with. So that was a very big challenge for me. And one of the items that is problematic for a lot of Irish records is that during the Civil War, which I believe was around 1922, a lot of the records were destroyed and or burned as part of the Civil War, which erased a lot of valuable information for anybody doing Irish research.
Yeah, 1922, that's the horror year for everybody because you just wonder what was destroyed. So what did you end up having available?
There's a number of resources that are actually out there. Some of them were transcriptions that were done prior to the Civil War. So some of that information exists for some records and for some counties in Ireland. So that was there. And there's some other documents that survived. But the majority of these documents either provide no names associated with, just counts of whether they were British subjects versus Irish subjects, or like many censuses we have here in the US before 1850 only provided the head of household. And so those were the records that I tended to focus on. And some of those records were like the muster rolls, which were to say who was capable of bearing arms in support of the king there. And that was in the 1600s. And there were some religious censuses that occurred in the mid 1700s. Then there's some other tax records that were also very valuable. There's the TIF allotment records in the early 1800s and the Griffith Valuation records, which are also tax records, and those were in the mid 1800s.
I've used a few of those, but some of those are unique. I have never used muster rolls or the freeholders records. And interesting about the Church of Ireland records. So Church of Ireland was similar to Church of England in that it was the Protestant answer to the Catholic Church. Is that correct?
That is correct. That record group was what the one that I started off with, and it provides some really good information. It provides what religion everybody was, and by head of household and listed by town. This was done so that, the Church of Ireland could know who was of which faith and could assert its dominance by knowing this information. And so that's what this information represented, and it represented the time frame of 1766.
Now, tell us more about how this religious census helped you use kind of the information you had found from the clusters and the fan club members and kind of pulled things together a little bit.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that to kind of step back and remind listeners, if they've listened to the first podcast, I had identified two groups of clusters, and both with County Fermanagh connections. They matched each other, but they were from different time periods in the US in terms of their immigration. So, my ancestor was born in early 1700s. There was that group. There's the group that arrived in the Pennsylvania, part of the Pennsylvania cluster, that was in the late 1700s. And then there was the New Haven cluster, which was in the mid 1800s. So I knew I wanted to start off with the earliest record group that would help me bridge my ancestors' likely origins in potentially the early 1700s with that Pennsylvania cluster, which is the next oldest group, which was they left Ireland after the Revolutionary War in the US is when they arrived. And the 1766 was kind of that sweet spot in between that era. And it also is the most comprehensive record group of data during that time period. And so what I did was I knew from my Pennsylvania cluster and my New Haven cluster, I had identified a few key surnames that were associated with those clusters beyond the Wilson surname. And that was Burgess and Cosgrove, which are more English or Scottish names, and Bannon and Farry, which were more Irish surnames. And so I use those as kind of like the fan club, friends, associates, and neighbors. And what I did was because Wilson is such a common name, and even back in 1766, it was a really common name. And I had to use the fan network to try to pinpoint where to focus my Wilson research. So what I did is I looked in County Fermanagh for those instances of the surnames Burgess, Bannon, Cosgrove, and Fari. And I found out that those names seem to be located in an area east of what is the capital of Fermanagh, which is Enniskillen. And they were in these two towns, one called Derry Hilag and the other one Cavan. And these two towns are only about 2.5 miles from each other, but that's where all of these surnames of interest were located. And then what I did was then say, okay, if this is probably the area that I needed to focus on, what Wilsons are located there? It was there that I found one group of Wilson, larger group in Derry Hilag, and one Wilson named Robert Wilson in the town of Cavan. And so that's how I use the religious census to kind of pinpoint an area within County Fermanagh to really begin a lot of my documentary evidential research.
That is amazing. The names that you pulled out of the autosomal DNA clusters then helped you locate where within the county to look for your Wilsons. That's just the perfect fan club strategy.
Thank you. I mean, it helps when you have names that aren't common matched with a name that is too common.
Hmm.
And I love the map that you created. Your visual is amazing.
Was that in PowerPoint too?
So I did that in PowerPoint. I'm a marketing professor, so I create my own lectures in PowerPoint. So I'm very well versed in it. And all that I did was I found a map in County Fermanagh showing me all the different townlands, is what they call the towns. And I put it in PowerPoint, and then I used a tracing tool in PowerPoint to give me the outlines that I needed. And then I could customize it, however I see fit to do so, which is what I've done in that visual that you're referencing.
Well, it's an amazing map. I need to learn that skill.
You could teach us sometime.
That is amazing. I love that. And I'm just so flabbergasted at your amazing visual. I forgot what I was going to say, but I am going to agree that using those unusual surnames was just brilliant. So good. Oh, I know. I wanted to talk about a little bit about the jurisdictions. So when you were diving into this Irish research, I'm sure you had to familiarize yourself with these different terms, parish and townland, and Ireland is a little crazy with jurisdictions.
They very much are. When I reference County Fermanagh, it's more as if it was a state, like Pennsylvania or Ohio. And then when you kind of take it down to the next level, it would be a barony, which I would kind of equate it to more of what we think of counties here in the US. Then you go down into the townlands, which would be more of like either a township or a town. And then when you think of parishes, that's more associated with the religious side rather than the civil side. And so it's very, very difficult to kind of sort out the overlapping boundaries. And, because a parish is going to be different than a civil record group. And it was just very challenging. And I think what helped me the most was finding a link to several sources that gave me an outline for, where these townlands were and for how to actually find them in a map. Because many of these you can't just Google and say, where is this townland? They don't really exist at that level in Google.
And this is a good plug for doing a locality guide, right? And having some place to hold all that information as you're gathering it.
It certainly is, and that was valuable to me.
Good, good. Well, let's talk about the next record group, the tithe allotment records. Tell us more about those.
Yeah, so this record group was very helpful because it was, again, another more complete set of records. It is a tax record that was used by the Irish government to kind of maintain dominance for the church. And so it was a tax on individuals. And it was fairly comprehensive, again, only providing the head of household, but by townland. And it was a way for me to kind of fill in the gap between when the Pennsylvania group left Ireland for America and the New Haven cluster when they left. So it was kind of a point in between. And it was another comprehensive record group. And so what I did, similar to the religious survey, is I looked at the fan club, plotted those, and concentrated on that area east of Enniskillen in the towns of Derryhelag and Cavancarragh, and again plotted them and plotted them with the Wilsons, and was able to see a very definitive pattern again, that you could see how the Wilsons were pushing out of the townlands of Derryhelag and moving into the surrounding townlands, and the same way for the Wilsons in Cavancarragh doing that. And then you also saw that with the others allied surnames of Fari and Bannon. Not so much with Burgess, but with those other ones, certainly.
So you think that they were just as the families were growing, they needed to move out to get more land, or what did you hypothesize with that?
So I did hypothesize exactly that they were kind of pushing out in search of new land to cultivate or to mill. And you could see that within the pattern, the way that they were kind of progressing out. And not to jump ahead to some of the historical context, but as I was reading about the area, that's exactly what a lot of them were doing. As populations grew, they need more land to support their families. And so I saw that there. And that was also some of the pretext for why some people migrated elsewhere outside of Northern Ireland as well.
That makes sense.
Okay, let's go talk now about Griffith's valuation. So, what were you able to glean about the Wilsons from that record set?
The Griffith valuations were a tax on agricultural land and built property. And this one was administered between 1848 and 1864. In my particular area that I was concentrating on was a little bit later in if I remember correctly, around the later 50s or early 1860s. And this wasn't so much as helpful for the Wilsons as it was for one of the fan clubs that was part of the clusters that I identified in both Pennsylvania and the New Haven cluster. It allowed me, along with the allotment records, to ensure that I was focusing in on the right area. And I was finding the Fari group, which is a surname associated with my Pennsylvania cluster, and that Bannon group, which was associated with the New Haven cluster. I was able to find them in these records. And that was confirmation to say, okay, I'm in the right area. And so my Wilsons are also likely from this area if I'm finding exact references to these other families in this area.
That's a kind of a good research check to follow things forward in time, make sure things are still fitting together in the right way, and do a little extra work to verify what you've been finding.
Absolutely. And, what was also interesting for anybody who's not worked with Griffith's valuation records, they actually do provide most places anyway, provide a detailed map of these locations, in so much that they will actually show where the houses are built and placed in those townlands. And you can see where families lived really adjacent to each other. I mean, like I'm talking like feet from one another. And that kind of confirms, family relationships amongst other items of interest.
Yeah, I've used Griffiths a few times, and it is a pretty interesting record set, and it's widely available now. Great resource. Well, you alluded to some historical context that really helped. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. So, kind of surmising what I had found in, the previous documentary and DNA was it pointed me to, two particular townlands, one Derryhelag and the other Cavancarragh. I wanted to understand the historical records, migrations, people, culture of those two townlands. What I did was I looked to what is probably maybe more non-traditional types of historical context. I know a lot of us will read different books and county histories, and Northern Ireland has county histories as well. There were several on County Fermanagh, so I read that. But I also sought out academic journals. And maybe because I'm a marketing professor, I'm more inclined to consider that record group. But these were academically written articles from a historical context talking about history in particular locations, some of them as specific to regions within County Fermanagh and others more broadly. But it really provided me the understanding to know what was going on during this time period. How likely were people to move beyond their small townland, and why would they even leave Northern Ireland? What I was able to learn, some really key pieces of information. A lot of the English and Scottish moved into County Fermanagh during the Ulster Plantation, which was about 1610. But around 1622, most migration into Northern Ireland really stopped. I mean, there were certainly some, but it was the majority happened in that first dozen or so years. And after that, population grew organically, either through additional generations or within internal migration. And that really kind of helped me understand, when did my Wilsons likely come and enter these two townland areas. And it also allowed me to understand, did the English or Scottish intermarry with the local Irish? And I found out that it was extremely rare. But the interesting thing is that Bannon's and Farry is Irish, Wilson and Burgess are English or Scottish, and there was some intermarriage that happened there, as evidenced in my DNA. And I found some other evidence too, kind of suggesting a Wilson and Bannon marriage, from the 1700s. So it really provided me that context to understand, how did my ancestor get from County Fermanagh to Pennsylvania?
I'm really glad you mentioned the scholarly journals because I agree. Sometimes those give you just what you need. We can access those on JSTOR, JSTOR, that website now. And it's amazing what you can find out there. People who have just done their thesis on something specific in history, and it may just give you the clue you need in your research. So I agree. We love county histories, but broadening our search can really help with that historical context.
I fully agree.
So, were there any more sources from the 1700s that you consulted at this point?
There was one other record group that was very helpful for me, and they're called the Freeholders Records. They represent a very early period of time in Northern Ireland history, really about the mid, maybe a little bit earlier in the 1700s. And this record group is for individuals who had owned land in Northern Ireland or had a lifelong lease to those lands. So it's not quite a census or something fully encompassing. But what it showed me was where some of my Wilsons were. And I saw some of the same patterns. They were in Derry Helag or the townlands right around it. And then what I saw interesting within this record is that there was no Wilsons in Cavan, where a lot of the other fan group was from. That Wilson didn't arrive until 1766. But what I found was there was another Robert Wilson that was somewhere else, close by, in those freeholders records. But then when I get to the 1766 religious census record, that Robert Wilson is in Cavan, but he's not in the freeholders record in that previous location, which suggested to me that I could kind of see some of those migration patterns, to the extent that that freeholders records was, encompassing of that area.
That's nice to see the migration there.
Yes, finding those record groups that provide the most encompassing periods of time that are more like a census that we're used to over here in the US, and then filling in those gaps with other record groups that maybe aren't as encompassing as a census, but still provide you meaningful data points in which to kind of connect those dots.
Yeah, you're really connecting a lot of dots here that are challenging to put all together. So it's a good example of using what we have and putting all the pieces of indirect evidence together to come to some ideas and conclusions about what was happening.
Yes.
And that's a good example of negative indirect evidence, too, that your Robert was not found in the 1766 census, so it suggested he had not yet migrated. A lot of times people are wondering, how do you use negative evidence? And this is a good example. And you don't just figure that out at first, that's from correlating everything else that you can start to use something like that,
Yes, I think correlation is very, very important.
which is why we write the reports, right? So What theories do you have based on the documentary and DNA evidence?
I have two. One is that my Wilsons were in this area well before the 1740s and 50s, which is kind of like the earliest record group of information, pointing my Wilsons to this location. And that there just happens to be no other records that will corroborate, that they were there as early as the early 1700s. And so that's one theory that, they were there at that point. And it's key to kind of remember that my ancestor was born likely around 1716. So that's kind of like the area I'm looking for. And my competing theory is that they likely moved into the area around 1750 from some other place within County Fermanagh or maybe neighboring counties. But I tend to migrate my own beliefs towards my first theory because I did find some references that point back to a time like right around 1700 to 1720 that I found two writings mentioning that Wilsons lived in and around Derry Helag at that time. And they specifically said they owned and operated a mill dating back to 1720 in one instance, and the other one said that at the time that somebody else, the major estate owner, was doing repairs, that the Wilsons were operating a farm there at that time. So it kind of suggests that my first theory is probably the likely one.
I love that you have some hypotheses that we are working to either prove or disprove. Well, that's great that you found mention of the Wilsons in that early time. What was the record? That was another publication.
Yes, it was two different publications. One was a documented history of County Fermanagh, and it was literally a footnote that said this Wilson operated a mill in this section outside of Derry Helag, which was interesting because they operated a mill. My ancestor, John Wilson, lived near a mill in Bucks County, suggesting that maybe he was doing what was familiar to his family by working in a mill when he first arrived Pennsylvania.
Right.
And the other one was a document where one of the estate owners who owned large chunks of land in County Fermanagh was reviewing all of his records in the family collection. And he happened to mention when he was talking about when there were major repairs to his estate, he mentioned that there was a farm owned by a Wilsons who could trace their male line back to this time period. And that time period, if I remember correctly, was like 1707 was when the repairs to his estate was being undertaken.
That's great. What a body of evidence you've collected with the DNA and the documentary work and the historical context. So fun to see it all come together.
It is. So let's summarize. What is the conclusion that you have come to and tying in, Robert Wilson and how he might relate with John Wilson?
I think the simple conclusion that I've come with is that John Wilson is likely from County Fermanagh. He may have been born there. I don't think I have enough evidence to suggest that he has or hasn't actually, but my belief is that he has, just based off of migration patterns into Pennsylvania at that time. I believe then, true because of the other evidence that I found, is that the Wilson ancestors likely came from Scotland, based off of that county history that I found from Lynn County, Iowa, mentioned in the previous podcast. I also believe that Robert Wilson, that I found living in Cavan is a critical individual to really understanding who John Wilson is. It's inconclusive to know whether this Robert Wilson is of the same age as my John Wilson, or if he's an older individual, suggesting that maybe he's the father. My belief is that this Robert Wilson that showed up in the 1766 religious census in Cavan is probably likely a brother, or maybe even an uncle of John Wilson, and that they probably share a common ancestor that comes from Derry Helag, which is where the majority of the Wilsons are known to have lived during that time period. So that's kind of the conclusion that I've come up with at this point.
That's wonderful. I think you've come to a satisfying conclusion for this research objective. And what's interesting about your objective is that you didn't say, I need to find the parents of John Wilson. You wanted to find his origins, his homeland, and something like that is one that we often can find an answer in a time when records are sparse and a lot of evidence for relationships is lacking. So it's neat that you were able to find an answer to your question. Now, the big question I have to ask you is, when are you going there?
I've been plotting it. So I'm actually thinking in 2023. A lot of my family members are interested in going and putting their eyes and feet on the same grounds. And so that's when I'm planning on going there and hitting those local depositories for records there. And so 2023 is the target year.
That's really soon. Congratulations. I hope it
Thank
works
you.
out. That will be fun.
Well, and so how great that you actually have a location. You're not just showing up in Ireland and going, okay, where are you? Because I honestly have heard others say, I just need to go to Ireland. And I'm like, yeah, you do need to go to Ireland, but you got to figure it out first where you're going to go. You've got such a good hypothesis of what happened there. And I am just looking at your report. We'll put a link to this in the show notes, but you can go on Rick's website and read his entire research report, which is 41 pages, and it has great visuals, completely source cited, takes you through the DNA as well as all the documentary work. And I love that you end up with future research suggestions because you're not done. You have some ideas.
Well, I don't think we're ever done, are we?
We're not, but I think it's just helpful to know that there is more you can do rather than just saying, okay, well, that's as good as it gets. I don't know what else I can do with this. I love that you've got 6 solid suggestions of what to do next.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed sharing my research with you and your listeners, and I really hope it inspires others to tackle that, especially if it's Irish research, because we know how much of a challenge that can be. Sometimes it's just digging in and getting your feet wet.
Absolutely. I know we have been inspired, so I'm sure our listeners are as well.
I know we've got some Scotch Irish immigrants that we have not even begun to trace back. We've got to get them out of the United States, or we've got to even get them past 1800, some of them. But we've got so much work to do. We'll get there.
I think in the next step might be a Y-DNA analysis, because I think that was a really key part of, how else could you have gotten the clue of where to go?
That was the linchpin.
Yeah, I think a good takeaway here is to track down a Y-DNA test taker for all of those lines in question. Just get it out there. And probably to eventually get to the 700 level, the Y-DNA 700 level, because you get more information. Would you agree?
You definitely, and I've written a recent blog post about targeted Y-DNA testing. And I think the key is not to jump into the big 700 first, because it's obviously quite expensive. Start out with the lowest level, make sure you have that match, and then increase it from there.
Because you don't have to retest, you just pay more and then you get to the next level.
Absolutely.
That's a really good strategy to start with. I think it's $119 right now for the 37 marker. Start there and then see if you want to continue. Well, thank you so much for writing the blog post series for us. Well, first of all, for even just giving us a shot with the study group. That's a big commitment. So we're so glad that we got to know you through that and that you came on the podcast and told us all about your research. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a great experience from the Research Like a Pro class, as well as just writing the guest blog. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Well, I put a link to Rick's website in our show notes, so make sure you go check out his new series about targeted Y-DNA testing and read his reports. And we hope you all have a great week, and we'll talk to you again next week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.